everybody. You're listening to, and if you're joining us through our live stream, you're watching the Comic Book Bears podcast. I'm Bill Zanowitz.
I'm Steve Morey.
And I'm Caleb Alexander McKenzie.
And we are your hairy, heavy homos that talk about comic books, but you don't have to be a hairy, heavy homo to listen in, or as I said, possibly stream in. And we are thrilled to welcome back to the show. It's been too long. We have Professor Christopher Michael Roman with us, who's going to talk about his book, Queering Wolverine. Very excited to hear about that. How you doing, Chris?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's our pleasure. And correct me if I'm wrong, it's the end of your semester?
I'm done.
All right.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so yes. Grades
Nice.
are,
Out of the
everything's
grading
graded.
bunker.
Grades are posted. I am in full winter break mode.
Oh,
In fact, I
Basically
spent a good portion of the day playing Spider-Man 2.
Oh, there you go. I was gonna say it's time for the video games and the couch
Yes.
surfing, the couch sleeping.
Absolutely.
yeah. How's everyone else doing? Because I know Caleb and I, we've had some days lately.
Yeah. It's it has been a rough week. Now, rough being a relative term. Work is just work, right? There's different things going on with it. And then today is the 2-year anniversary of when we had to say goodbye to my longtime pet. So remembering her and enjoying seeing those pictures and stuff. But today was a good day. And while Bill said it's been too long since Dr. Chris has been back on the show, this is actually my first time. We are breaking the Caleb Chris cherry here. So cheers. And so in honor of this momentous occasion, I am having a nice glass of Tin Cup bourbon. We were talking before the show. He was asking me what the brand was, and I could not remember, so I scooted out to get it. So, shameless plug. Tin Cup, send me money.
Yes. Well, Caleb, I certainly hope that your experience with the NFL in a couple of weeks is better than mine on Monday, seeing a game in person. I was very happy to be there. Wasn't that cold, but
I will be in attendance in Dallas on the 30th to watch the Cowboys versus the Lions and hopefully see my beloved Cowboys prevail, much to the chagrin of everybody. I realize that I'm a Cowboys fan, which is the most hated creature on the planet.
Yeah.
But by the way, did y'all see that momentous occasion last week where they beat the ever-loving shit out of the Philadelphia Eagles?
Yeah, you can stop talking about it now.
33-13. Did you see that? I saw
stop talking about it now. Yeah,
saw it with my eyeballs.
You talked it. You talked about it. Yeah. But just to fill everybody in, I was at MetLife Stadium seeing the Packers unfortunately lose to the Giants.
But you looked good while they did it.
Yeah, and we almost pulled it out. And that was
close.
a killer because I was on the train back by that point. Because wins and all.
I was
Monday
actually
night
speaking
games are
about
rough, man. Well,
you personally, you looked good while they were doing it. Your whole get up was working.
Well, the thing is, I did have an accident with the mustache. I had to go the mustache route due to a shaving accident, but the beard's almost back, so I'm like rocking the stash with stubble thing for a little while.
It works.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very
it's almost there. Yeah, I'm gonna send this to you, Caleb, just because you're being an asshole. You can do whatever you want with it.
And
also I'm close to Chrisville in that tomorrow is my last day of work for the year. So I need that break. And a tidbit that I'd like to offer, if people were not aware of this, our most downloaded episode is the one that Chris was on when we talked about Legion. That is our most downloaded episode.
Wow.
We have
interesting.
Since we have all my past failed podcasts also in the feed, there's some others that are like yapping at its heels, like that Kiss episode on the music from The Elder,
which was really awesome. I would say
it was. I would love to do that every week, but that was also like hell to plan too. But I expect even better numbers with this. So.
The pressure.
All right, Professor, tell us about the book. Tell us about, maybe just the Reader's Digest elevator pitch version of it, and then we'll get into it.
All right. So basically, my book, Queering Wolverine, is about the ways in which Wolverine is queer, right? So start there. But the premise kind of is, so if we read mutants as sort of other in the larger Marvel universe, we tend to read them as queer in some way. What's interesting about Wolverine, I think, is that he is, for lack of a better word, he's sort of a favorite of dude bros, straight dude bros, right? And so it's all snick, killing, right? And I just, when I came up with this book, I was thinking that that's not quite how I read him. And like, if we're going to go with the mutant metaphor as mutants are queer, like, how does he fit into that? If people tend to read him as this sort of overly hyper masculine person. So I went back and I looked at early stuff and noticed, I talk about the way in which he's drawn, his the focus on his naked body, in all kinds of different ways. And then the next chapter, I talk about the way he creates relationships, and he's actually quite a nurturer. And then the last chapter, I talk about fan fiction, and how fans sort of react to him and make him a very queer character, in all kinds of different ways, and very, very sexual and kinky. So that particular chapter was a lot of fun to write, because it's like, oh, I get to read porn. Yay.
Oh, all the work
and write about it.
Dude.
Porn with a purpose.
Right, porn with a purpose. In an academic setting. So yeah. So in a nutshell, that's what it's about. I was trying to sort of recuperate the character and think about the ways in which he fits into this sort of the mutant metaphor as queer, and try to unpack that.
Okay, so in the past, I have bogarted interviews, so we've worked out a method where that doesn't happen. So think of this as a race, and we're starting with the baton, and Steve goes first. I'll come up at the rear. I know Caleb's chomping at the bit, so we'll start with Steve. Steve, what do you have for Chris?
Well, this is kind of right up my alley. I was when I was coming up through undergrad and post grad, it was all really focused on queer theory, from multiple lenses. I was more of a film dork, as much as I was, a lit dork. So, I got this. I got it from both ends there,
Right.
that media spectrum. But did not do a lot of graphic novels or comics, which is really interesting because, of course, I had stopped reading superhero comics by that point. I hadn't read any in like 10 years. And now kind of going back and seeing this, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of interesting interpretations that we can make of certain characters. And of course, there's a lot more queer, like openly queer representation. I think that's one thing that you've mentioned a few times. While writing this is like, the era that Wolverine was created was not, there wasn't a lot of open representation in the pages of Marvel Comics or any comic book other than, that was at least in the mainstream. And it's kind of been developed over the past 40, almost 50 years of Wolverine, that there's, been a change where, you may have had sort of the X-Men as a metaphor for the queer experience and the queer minority experience, but now they're actually openly queer X-Men, and been, retconned as gay or queer, and some that have been introduced as queer. And reading this also kind of brought me back to my little proto-gay brain, which, of course, Wolverine was always one of my favorites. I remember in one of the early issues of the, unadjective or adjectiveless X-Men, there is a scene where Wolverine presumably has just finished having sex with Jean Grey. And it turns out, of course, it's Mystique. And there's a lot of emphasis on, how beefy and hairy and everything he is, and very sexual, but also very emotionally disconnected. And sort of like using her as a way of just kind of fulfilling a fantasy of sorts. But yeah, like reading him as queer is very interesting. And I hadn't really thought of him that way until relatively recently, when you had Greg Pak's in an alternate Earth where he's openly gay and in a relationship with Hercules, which
right,
by hero, openly by hero in
right.
multiverse. Where he's he's basically kind of subverting that whole, well, he's gruff, he's mean, but he's into ladies, and he's
Mm-hmm.
very likes being intimate with the ladies. But yeah, actually going back and as a little young proto gay and reading Wolverine, I always kind of saw him as a very much hyper masculine,
Mm-hmm.
ideal, but also really hot,
Mm-hmm.
which is really interesting because he's constantly drawn, he's constantly referred to as being like ugly and gross,
Right,
grotesque and twisted and whatnot.
right,
His body is just, he's short and he's just like really thick and covered
right.
in hair, and I'm like, yes, and
Yes,
um,
and right.
yes, and please. So like going into this and reading back, looking at the different examples and the evolution of how Wolverine's been represented, in the pages, just narratively, but
Mhm.
also graphically, where did you see a lot more of that kind of interesting interpretation from did you see it more in like the writers or the artists in developing sort of this understanding of Wolverine as a queer body and like the different forms of Wolverine? Did you what do you think had the greater influence on your understanding and also in the direction of your analysis of looking at Wolverine as a queer body?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Um, so I think so. I will say both, right? But I'm going to say both in different ways. So artistically, like I think that ugliness is kind of a queer response, right? In
Mhm.
a world of comic book heroes that are supposed to be perfect and you know they're perfect but like they're unreal, right? um Wolverine isn't. I mean, his physical characteristics are constantly commented on, and in that way, it sort of makes him kind of a queer figure. Just in terms of just the normativity of every other sort of superhero, like he's like you said, and there's a strain of queer theory that looks at ugliness as a kind of queer response to
Yeah.
normative beauty, right?
Mhm.
So I mean, so he's ugly, right? And he's hairy, and I mean, we don't get very many hairy superheroes, right? He's short, right? Smokes too much. He's got crazy hair. So like,
Mhm.
all those things that, and I kind of talk in the book a little bit about like it's too much. His too muchness is what I kind of call it, which is sort
Mhm.
of this queer response, that he overflows his boundaries, right? He's a body that is bigger than that can't be contained, right? So artistically, I think a lot of artists sort of play with that, and sometimes he's sort of we'll call him quote unquote normal, but I think more more often than not, there's this artists oftentimes will like sort of emphasize certain things, right? Like they'll emphasize his hair, or they'll emphasize his the way in which his body works, like he's sort of hunched over, right? Because he's so heavy, right? So artistically, I feel like there's a way in which we or I was sort of drawn to that, right? Like looking at the ways in which different artists really sort of experiment with how he looks. And I feel like it's like we can have a field day with this sort of what does ugly mean, right? And yet at the same time, there's an attractiveness to that too, right? On the writing side, I feel like so it's like decoding things, right? So there's a really great essay by Jonathan Warner in the LGBTQ Comic Studies Reader, where he talks about how um, even though there may not be queer representation in older comics, that we as queer people often go back and sort of read things into those comics and sort of or decode what's going on. And so like whether the writer intended or not, right? And I'm thinking about like Chris Claremont sort of we could say it was intentional. We knows, but like as readers, I feel like it's you know we bring that to the story, right? So when we bring our queerness to these stories and start, decoding these messages, like then those characters become like queer in certain ways. So maybe the writer didn't necessarily intend that, but we sort of found those figures and identified with them, right? And those became sort of our queer, our queer family, and for lack of a better word, and there's comics, and I think Wolverine is one of those. Like, I've always sort of identified with him. I've always enjoyed reading his stuff, but I think for me, the stuff that's really interesting are the stories in which he is sort of a nurturer, or when he's like trying to build people up, or he does something surprising, like you think he's going to be like. I love that, and I don't talk about this in the book, but there's that and I'm going to totally blank on which Uncanny X-Men issue this is, but it's the one where he says he's going to go hunting, and Storm gets very, very upset with him, like, how dare you, da 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 da. And he says, well, I'm not. That's anybody can kill. The point is for me to be able to sneak up and touch the deer, right? And that's the fun of it. And there's like oh, you're much more complex and interesting than we realized, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like that's that's one of those moments where like this character can be really, really interesting and really, really complex. And certain writers really emphasize that. And that's beyond the sort of hyper masculine violent stuff, right? And that I feel like that's what really makes Wolverine an interesting character. So to answer your question, yeah, it's both of those. It's like the art and the writing do that.
Yeah, and we haven't even gotten on the fan fiction side of things, but yeah, I mean, there's definitely there's a mix of sexuality that is some writers have touched on. Obviously his history, like Claremont's written about him with his history with Mariko, and of course his obsession potentially, or romance, or subverted romance with Jean Grey, which eventually became a true romance later on. But this is, like you said, this is sort of an ugly, queer character that does not fit what we would expect a comic reader to actually say, like, oh yeah, here's somebody who's like a physical ideal, getting his pick of women in a less, in a completely, I would say, more of the 70s, 80s, 90s, where like obviously sexuality became a thing, where before it was just sort of like everybody just kind of is very platonic and I Love Lucy or whatever. But it's just it is really interesting that here's this character, and this is mostly in X-Men. Once we start going outside of like the X-Men titles, I think Wolverine's only fitting that role as the hypermasculine violent killer. Doesn't really get to be used in any other way, I don't think. Like once we get out of his the X-Men titles and his own miniseries and his own series, I think we're he's less interesting of a character. But in X-Men, you have these writers like Chris Claremont. You've got you've got Ben Percy now, but previously you've also had oh my gosh, I'm blanking.
I think Larry Hama
here. Larry Hama, yes.
Yes.
Who are taking this character and making him, really fleshing out sort of everything. I mean, this is a character who's older canonically than all the X-Men,
right.
And yet, they've come up with this idea of making his brain essentially just a palimpsest, where like every bit of his memory has been erased and rewritten and erased and rewritten and erased and rewritten over and over and over again, because of the way his body treats memory and trauma and all of that. So, but yeah, I think I want to throw this over to Caleb, because I think he wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the stuff before I go off and I start talking about the cyborg and the pig imagery, which
Well,
Yeah, really.
Steve, I think what I'm going to talk about is actually going to be a good segue into that and bounce it back. I do want to say, Steve, I do take your point about Wolverine inside the X-Men and some of his appearances outside. There are some moments though when Wolverine is on the Avengers that nurturing side does come out, right? That not necessarily. I don't like to call it fatherly. A lot of people do that. I don't think that's what it is. It is paternal, but it's not fatherly. And there is a difference with that. But he showcases some of that while he's in the Avengers as well. And it is that team kind of bond that brings out what I think is the best of Wolverine. It is that complexity and that nuance to his persona that is built into a team and kind of this mentorship, which is queer in and of itself, right? It's this chosen family kind of situation. But Chris, we were talking a little bit ago, as Steve said, he was kind of raised and nurtured on queer theory. My undergrad is in creative writing and literature, but I tend to view things more towards a Marxist lens, and that's always where I've viewed and I've read Wolverine stories. Right, you kind of take this idea of the mutants or Wolverine, and you run it through the lens that says, hey, capitalism, it doesn't allow for anything outside the norm unless it can be commodified and used, right? And you talk about in your first chapter, you touch on a little bit of that, but again, you're not purposefully viewing it through that lens. You're not dissecting it through that lens. But you do say one thing that I found fascinating, right? You said a lot that I found fascinating, not just one thing. But you said specifically talking about the Weapon X story, which was written and drawn and inked and everything by Barry Windsor Smith, who is one of my pinnacles of the medium. But you say the story is remarkable for its exploration of Logan's quote-unquote ugly body as it continuously displays and dissects Logan's body while it undergoes the adamantium bonding process. Windsor Smith critiques the ways that the government normalizes the weaponization of the male body by making its character and making the readers a witness. By challenging the reader's ethical and normalizing stance, Windsor Smith urges the reader to rethink the aesthetics of the superhero. You touched on something there, and as I was reading this, like a light bulb started going off, and it went off. Because this isn't just a train of thought with Logan, right? This is a train of thought. I think you put your finger on the pulse of something that Barry Windsor Smith is exploring, not only through Logan and Wolverine, but through a lot of his works, right? Much of what you tapped into there is almost it's written into the DNA of monsters. And I'm not sure if you.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Like so much of that is in there, and that's what he's talking about. Is this governmental commodification of non-conformity, of queerness, right? And that's not queerness as the definition of queer equals gay or something like that. It's non-conformity, right? It's this idea of and I think he fits into that because of his non lily white hodgepodge relationships, right? He's not monogamous, right? He does not fit into this kind of normal stance. And I really appreciate what you did there. I found that very interesting because that's so true. And when I read the book and when I read Logan's stories, I came out my early 20s. I never read Logan, I guess because I had more of the stories I could go and kind of pick and choose. And I'm curious about your thoughts on this. I never read Logan as, for me, being that hyper masculine figure. I didn't hang out with people who exuded that, right? I always found him to be kind of this vehicle of, okay, especially for me, like there is something here about the, strapping him to a table, shoving him into a tank, doing science experiments. There's almost something very conversion therapy about it, right? And you're brainwashing him, you're wiping him clean, right? You're creating a weapon. And I did not myself go through conversion therapy. I've got friends who had to suffer through that and everything. But is that, do you see a similar vein there? And is that kind of what you're talking about in the quote unquote, the ugliness of the nonconformity being issued in a non Clark Kent, this non monolithic kind of standard?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you bring up Monster because I feel like when I was drafting that chapter, that book came out and I was kind of like, wow, this really, because I forget how long Barry Windsor Smith spent on Monster. It was decades,
15 years. Yeah.
And so when it came out, I was like, wow, like I was wondering if he had started that when he did the Weapon X story, because so many of those themes were echoed back and forth between the two, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was really intrigued by the idea that so you brought up a really interesting point about the ways in which the Weapon X story really highlights how passive he is to the whole situation, right? And so that's interesting that you talk about conversion therapy, because I hadn't really thought about the echoes there. But like, yeah, the sort of brainwashing and the ways in which conversion therapy is trying to attempt to normalize the queer, right?
Yeah.
And in that way, the Weapon X program is trying to normalize the superhero in terms of your purpose is to work for, or follow orders and be our normative weapon that we're going to aim, and you just enact what we say. But Wolverine resists that, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting about Wolverine is that he resists that subconsciously, even, right? I mean, that's the fascinating thing about the Weapon X story, is that for a good portion of that story, he's unconscious, right? And so it's all his body is just reacting. So it's like the queer cannot be contained, right? Which is how I kind of read that story.
Yeah.
Like, you could try to deny, you could try to repress as much as you want, but you're, eventually that, the harder you squeeze, the more it's going to squirt out. So he's going to resist that, right? Wolverine is going to squirt out, which is a funny metaphor.
That's the name of the 4th chapter.
Yeah, that's right.
That's
Squirting out with Wolverine.
Well, yeah, you do have a portion here called fluids. So.
Yeah, that's right. Right. I mean, it is interesting how the flu. And that's the thing, right? Ultimately, like, so the Weapon X program attempts to normalize him, but at the same time, it provides him with, it provides him with a structure. How do I want to put this? So it's like the Weapon X program is attempting to normalize him, but all it does really is accentuates his queerness, right? So in the end, it just forces him to be even more queer, right? Because now he's got to embrace his destructive and reconstructive properties, right? His healing factor plus his adamantium claws, which I always think is a really fascinating way to read him. Is that he's both life-giving and destructive at the same time, right?
Yeah, I'm
so
gonna
it forces
here.
that. Okay.
I'm gonna interrupt here just because Caleb and I, before the show, we were talking about how a lot of Barry Windsor Smith's work has tremendous queer sensibilities. If you've ever read Rune,
Yeah.
it's there, basically out in the open. And Chris, I was wondering, with some of the discussion points we've just touched on right now, would you say that Weapon X is the closest he has to a coming out story?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Because it is,
Yeah.
at the core, there is that quest, there is that
Right.
opening.
Yes. Right.
And so much of the story involves essentially vivisection,
Right. Yeah.
and
Sure.
that it seems that this is, he isn't necessarily Wolverine, but he's not Logan until this moment occurs, as far as I've read it.
Yeah. Sure. So it's interesting you bring that up, because I've got so many issues with I call it the tyranny of the coming out story, right?
Yeah.
So I teach. So not only do I do a lot of work with graphic novels and comics and stuff, but I teach a year-long course on queer memoir. And so we read all kinds of different, queer, life writing kind of things. And it's really difficult to get away from. It's like every queer story has to be my coming out story, right? So I try to search for ones that are not doing that, and it's tough because I think as queer people, the expectation is that part of your life story is that you're going to have that coming out moment, right? And it's telegraphed, right? And it's a way for normative heteroculture to put a timeline on queer people, so that your life really begins when you come out, right? So I have this problem with the coming out story. And Bill, this is you asked a great question. So I'm not bagging on your question or anything, but I'm wondering if we do that, then like, are we taking away something from the Wolverine story, right? If Weapon X is kind of like his coming out, I mean, it could be his coming out story, but I don't know. I feel like it's not necessarily a coming out story, but more along the lines of a story in which he's maybe discovering, or it's the beginnings of how to read him as a queer person.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So it's not necessarily Wolverine saying, "Hey, everybody," it's not that so much as look at the ways in which our culture tries to normalize someone, right? Look at the ways in which, because you are quote unquote different, the structures of society are going to try to repress you in different ways and put you in a mold. And I actually artistically that works really well, I think, with the Weapon X story, because there's a lot of images of Wolverine in tanks, like in like liquid tanks, or like there's that really great one. It's like he's almost body shaped, where they're hooking up all the nodes and wires to him, and it fits his body exactly right. So it's a mold. And the thing about Wolverine is he's going to resist all the molds, right? So it's not. I don't know if it's necessarily a coming out story as much as it's a how does Wolverine break the molds, and then we can go from there. You know what I mean? I'm trying to think of what like would be a good Wolverine coming out story. Like which one would be really his like coming out story? Like is it like, does it take till Hoxpox to like for him to come out and be like, ooh, Scott Mosquito.
Probably.
Scott, now we know Wolverine. Well, I mean, in this universe, I think if like you brought up the Hercules and him story. I forget what universe that is, like 11638 or something like that. Yeah, so it's something like that. Like there's a coming out. There's a certain way there's a coming out. Like, hey, look, it's gay Wolverine. It's almost like the closest we get to a Wolverine like coming out is the like infographic where the rooms are open to Jean Grey's room, and it's like, oh, look at that queer throuple.
Yeah.
now it's there. I don't know. So yeah, I think I read the Weapon X story just a little bit differently in terms of it's the beginnings of his queerness, but I think it ends up being more a story about how institutions really can be repressive. And so and then sort of like you can't repress the queer, basically, is what.
I mean, I just came from it at from the perspective of the more forces that motivate's a lousy word, but push you towards the direction of normative. Sometimes the more feral comes out and the more honest comes out, and that's why. And honestly, like my consideration of this, happened at like 9:58 p.m. So this isn't something that I thought about for a long time. Yeah,
I think that's the thing about comics too. Like they're recursive and they repeat, so they don't follow sort of a linear pattern in a certain way, like no. In terms of time. So like you raise a really good point. Like what would be that moment that we might point to and say, what is Wolverine's coming out story? And I'm not 100% sure what that would be. I think you raise a really interesting question.
Yeah, in my head, it's off panel right after Marvel Treasury Edition number 27 when he and Hercules are at the bar. It's page 8 and we only had like 6 pages there, so in my head that is
just on this topic though. I like the way that everybody's kind of approaching this, right? Like, and it's that literary mechanism we have. Like to Bill's point, Bill had a hypothesis: is this his coming out story? And then you talk to the story and you see how the story maps into that, and you come out the other end and you say, okay, this part works for that part doesn't. And like that's the kind of literary critique that we're trained to engage in. I really like that. For me, I look at it kind of going back to the way we talked earlier. it is a way, like, and I look at things through a kind of a modern socio-political lens, right? We see a lot of this happening now, where there is a certain aspect of the world that will take queerness and they will accept it if they can use it to weaponize it against other queer people. To
Sure.
me, this is like looking at it through that kind of structure. This is a way where, Wolverine, whether it was of his own accord or not, he was co-opted by a group that said, okay, we're gonna take your queerness, right? We can't take that away from you. We're going to use it. We're going to weaponize it. We're going to effectively use you as a weapon against those other people.
Mhm.
And Wolverine rejected that, right? We see a lot of that. There are people who are willing to, look, we'll vote for queer folks as long as you take women's rights away. We'll vote for queer folks as long as you take queer rights away, right? We will use you, and there's a tokenism aspect of it too.
Mhm.
And that's kind of the way I look at that. And I'm curious, like, do you think viewing it through that lens, what does that say about the modern version of Wolverine, this kind of person that we see now who is willing to engage in polyamory, and who is this kind of nurturing paternal figure to people like Jubilee, or even to Storm to a degree? I mean, or beyond the relationship that he has with Storm.
Yes, man, that's you've got light bulbs coming off for me. So you raise a really great point in terms of that's the interesting thing about Wolverine too, is the way in which he resists, right? So he's not going to go along with institutional, frameworks, right? He's always going to be that critical queer. So yeah, that's a really great reading in terms of he's resisting the institutionalization of the government, the weaponization of his body against other queer people, right? He does that as well, even within the quote unquote queer community. Like he's always sort of the critical crux, right? And that's why I think he's such an important character, because he sort of represents the ways in which there are different ways to approach the queer problem, right?
Yeah.
And to suggest that the queer community is varied and different, and that all kinds of voices are valid, right? That's why I think his role as like a nurturer is really important, because and I talk about this in the book some too. Like he's really good at showing the individual mutant how to be their own mutant, right? And so I talk about that Kitty Pryde mini,
Yeah.
and like one of the, you know, Bill, we go back to your question, like maybe that's his coming out story, that Claremont mini. But anyway, so in that one of the fascinating things that he does there is allow for Kitty to be her own queer person, right? Her own mutant, and he never sort of imposes his sort of like as any kind of patriarchal institution. He like puts up guardrails for her, little bumpers, but never sort of tells her what to do. So that there's that really great moment where she's like discovering who she is, and she's walking through the thunderstorm, and she comes up with like, oh, this is going to be my name now, and it's this. But like he's kind of helped her get to that point, as opposed to, and again, I make this point in my chapter, instead of sort of replacing another father figure, what he tries to do is sort of a non-hierarchical mentorship, which is sort of a queer move, because when we think about mentors, it's supposed to be like the one who knows everything, and then it's my little Padawan, right? And he doesn't do that. He never wants to be a force that overwhelms that person. And so I think he does this with Jubilee. I think he does this with other people, Armor. And I feel like, to kind of go into modern Wolverine, I feel like that's a thing that's sort of missing from his story. I have a lot of, I, I, I really don't like the modern Wolverine. I have a lot of problems with Percy's writing. I haven't really liked this. I feel like there's been a lot of missed opportunities in terms of Wolverine's queerness, and one of them I really do feel like is that there's no sort of mentorship. He's been a like. I've never quite understood if Wolverine is the sort of critic, right? He's always voiced his criticism, and yet in this sort of era, he's never voiced a clear criticism of Krakoa. He's just been like, you know what I mean? And it's like,
how do you do that again?
That's what it feels like. I've never seen a clear articulation of what's wrong with Krakoa. Like, okay, Wolverine, you could be your loner self, which I think, I respect, but I've never seen him articulate like, what's the problem here?
I have a theory on that, because I've actually spoken with other people about this as well, right? Because we've had this talk, like, why, there, even with Wolverine, and there's not a good way to box it in, but like, he does have this kind of like a libertarian stance, like this queer libertarian stance, right?
Right, sure.
But in Krakoa, at least in this short era, somebody made the argument that it's the first time he's ever actually got to be comfortable and happy and like have the relationships that he wanted without having to subvert somebody else or go around or have to come to head with Scott. Like they finally just said, hey, we can be comfortable with this, right? We've got our moon fuck pad, like, I don't know what else to call it, like, werewolf sex on the moon, but like we've got that, and we are now. It almost like, and by the way, I mean, we've talked about this, and it's not the greatest time to talk about this, but I tend to view Krakoa as kind of a semi metaphor for Israel, right? Like this notion, and for the first time, it was this person is actually on top, and he's not pushing back, because now like he's more of a protective mode. Like, I'm happy, I get to have my family of all varieties, right? And I now have I get to go into we get to go into offense instead of defense for the first time in a long time. And so I think those things may be a window to that, like good, bad, or otherwise. I'm not defending anything, but just in that conversation, like that was the first time in a long time, well, really, that I got to see Wolverine be comfortable in his relationships, right? With being able to take a breath. So that might be why it is. I don't know that the writers have thought that deep about it as much as like Caleb with a glass of tin cup.
I'm gonna jump in there, and there's a couple explanations for that. Yes, comfortable with relationships and all of that, but also, one point that's been kind of part of his character since Barry Windsor Smith's Weapon X, story, was that he's constantly in pain and he's constantly fighting. Of course, they revealed that much later on in the Death of Wolverine, that he's been fighting this internal cancer this entire time, with the adamantium poisoning him and him constantly healing himself. With Hoxpox, all that is gone. He's fine. He's got his adamantium back, but it's not bad for him now, and he's not in constant pain, and everything's good. And there's all of that, anything that kind of gave that internal, reason for his suffering has been eliminated. Even like memories that were a problem, like that's been kind of eliminated off page. So at the beginning of this Krakoan era, he's just kind of like, yeah, everything that kind of made me is fixed now. I'm fine. I've got my happy throuple relationship. I don't have anything that's trying to kill me, and even if they were, well, I can't die anyway, so it doesn't matter. I did die, but I got better. It's kind of like an interesting thing, but there is a conflict that's in there. There is the institution he's pushing back, and that really kind of shows up in X-Force with Beast, and that's kind of like that whole Beast arc where he's become like the supervillain behind everything.
Right.
And that's who he's pushing back against. He's not pushing back against Charles. He's not pushing back against Eric. It's just kind of like, okay, well, everything's kind of fine for me, but I'm being turned back into a weapon, and the one who's kind of doing that is Beast. And so I think we're that kind of, maybe that's kind of coming back.
I like this train of thought, but in my brain, that it then becomes problematic, because what we're saying is now this queer persona is inherently defined by queer trauma, and that if the queer trauma is gone, all of a sudden you go back to being that normalized ideology where you can be a weapon, and then you become hegemonious, right? So I mean, just like, I think it's fascinating. Like, I'm not saying that's true or not true. Like, just following that framework down, it becomes rooted in, okay, my persona or like the queer persona is inherently tethered to queer trauma and the onset of constant fear and constant pain. And if you take that away, then what does that make us, right? And I think it's a fascinating thought process. I want to twist it back to some of the body stuff, just so because I know Bill and Steve are both wanting to talk about that. We talk about the cyborg aspect of it, and this notion of being a part of it being this kind of external stimulus, and I think that also ties into this kind of the quote unquote ugly body, which to me I've always said, I think especially Barry Windsor-Smith, he's doing a lot of the same stuff that Tom, like my personal hero, did. He's going to show you a different aspect of male beauty that we had not considered before. And I've always thought that Wolverine followed that framework. So, what does that say? Like, what does that external kind of like the quote unquote cyborg stimulus say about him and say about his status in not only the Marvel universe, but us in reading him as kind of this icon?
Did you just pick up a book of Tom of Finland? Is that what that was?
Yeah. That's
okay. I wasn't sure. I couldn't see it from the. Okay, nice.
Yeah, so that's the hockey. I have a Tom of Finland within arm's reach at all times.
Mine's over there. It's way over there. So anyway, it's like how can I fit Wolverine into Tom of Finland stuff? How can I make that connection? Anyway, so I think to answer your question, I want to talk about sort of the hybrid nature of Wolverine, which I think also again is sort of like talking about the queer body, right? That he is not, I mean, already he's not sort of quote unquote human, right? Because he's a mutant, but also the addition of metal into his body also makes him different as well, right? So he's got to navigate. I mean, and I think this is part of the key thing about the Wolverine story is that he's got to navigate between being all these sort of ands, right? So not only is he a mutant, but he's also a cyborg. He's also almost nearly immortal. Right? So he's got to navigate all of these different identities, which I think also speaks to just the nature of being a queer person, right? We're always sort of navigating, we're always navigating, where is it safe, right? Or we're navigating like who can we tell about our queerness, or who should we not tell about our queerness?
Yeah.
So I think that in that way, that hybrid body, that cyborg body, also it talks about the different ways in which our bodies exist in the world, right? So, if we're reading comics as sort of reflections of our political moment or how we culturally understand ourselves, that hybrid body is something that we're all struggling with. We can think about disability issues, right? And the ways in which institutions, allow or disallow, a disabled person's being, right? Or just the ways in which we all are hybrids in some way. We're all sort of, if you wear glasses, if you have an artificial heart, if you, if you're on some sort of medication, even, right? That's a kind of technology that's put inside our bodies. It sort of makes you rethink what the human is. So that's one of the other things that I think that Wolverine does. Like it like his hybrid nature, makes us sort of rethink what is that. Not only what is the human body capable of, but like where do we draw the lines, and how those lines get broken in terms of what is a body, right? What is a human body? So I think he sort of raises those questions for us on how we define ourselves.
And I think there's also something in that conversation about just the aesthetics of it as well. I mean, like, again, if we're looking at this through that lens and we're talking about how things relate in a lot of ways, setting aside, like you said, this conversation about ableism and that, but if we're talking about so much of the visage of what it is with the mechanics and stuff, it's this kind of aesthetic of appearance. I mean, that I'm sitting here with tattoos, right? Like, but I mean, we also, there's a notion of bringing this into the queer framework. What does aesthetics say about a person's identity, right? When we talk about trans identity, is it that physical, I wear women's clothes, right? I identify as a woman, ergo I wear women's clothes. Right. What about non-binary people? I mix and match. And what does that say about my identity?
Sure.
queer sexuality and the use of toys and that kind of thing. These things
Sure.
that we were not born with, that but we need to utilize as a part of our day-to-day life.
Right.
That is a fascinating way to look at that. And
Sure.
I realize I am co-opting the conversation. I'm so sorry.
No, I think that's great, because I think that really makes you think about the ways in which we extend our bodies into space, right? Like, there's that sort of not normative way of like, this is my body, right? But bodies are porous, they're fluid, right? And then, you know, that's a point I make about Wolverine. Like,
Yeah.
that's one of the interesting things to think about him. If you're in a wheelchair, right, that wheelchair is part of your body. If you know you're, you know, like I said, if you wear glasses or if you've got a hearing aid, like, those are all extensions of your body. You know that's part of you. And that kind of makes you a cyborg, right? You are futuristic. So that really makes us kind of rethink these very rigid ways of understanding the body. Because, you know, even like technologically speaking, like our phones, you know, we don't want to go, like, think about the last time you panicked because you left your phone somewhere. Because your phone is an extension of your body now. It's got your memory on it. It's got photos, right? It's got all of these things that sort of define who you are, and that could be, you know,
it's
pluses
also
or
the way that
minuses.
it's
Yeah,
also
go
the way
ahead.
that you connect with community, right? If I
Right,
didn't have my
absolutely.
phone, I literally my two of my best friends live in Jersey and Carolinas. Like,
Yeah.
I would not get to connect with them, right? And I have to talk to them to help be who I am, right?
Right, right,
To that point.
right. Yeah, right. So like your body, right, through your phone has extended geographically over space and time. But we don't think about. I think there's that way in which, oh, my body's my body, right? And yeah, the ways in which sort of the medical institution defines what the body is, right? But I think comics kind of ask you to rethink that, ask you to kind of rethink what your bodily boundaries are, and the ways in which your body extends in space in all kinds of different philosophical ways. And these things might be more. Your body might be more invisible, right? And it might have a more invisible extensions
Well, the
than
self
we
certainly,
realize.
from the
Right,
philosophical, the self absolutely is. I mean,
right,
what you're
absolutely.
talking about is this kind of biological notion of surviving
Right.
versus this philosophical notion of thriving, as a
Yeah,
like you
absolutely.
argued, right?
Right.
You know,
Well, you know, and it's funny that we bring this up because I just finished an essay that's going to be in a collection about, I think it's called Comics and Data or something like that. And so I talk about Iron Man 2020, and talk about the definition of the self. And in that comic, right, the premise is that Tony Stark isn't convinced that he's the real Tony Stark. He thinks he's an AI. And so one of the philosophical things about that text is that it asks us to think about is, does the self exist without a body? And so what would that mean? And so the comic kind of comes down on ultimately that, yeah, Tony Stark is made up of digital and biological things, and that he is Tony Stark / Iron Man, even though he he has to sort of, he's convinced by his by Friday that he actually is Tony Stark. And so he's, you know, she helps him put himself back together again. But it's a really interesting story because I mean, there's all kinds of other stuff about the ethics of artificial intelligence and how much do we respect them, which I think is a really hot topic right now.
sure.
But it really asks us to rethink again, like, what is a self in this digital age? And if we are like, if we download ourselves into, you know, whatever computer database, would we still be a self? Would we still have an identity? And the comic says yes. But you know, I think that that's a really interesting, and again, it's the way I feel like comics really challenge us to rethink, you know, bodies and identity and self, and you know, some of the themes that we're talking about tonight. And so I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. Like, okay, if I didn't have my body, but I had all these algorithm patterns or digital chips, like, would I still be a person?
You and I need to have
Sure.
a weekend long retreat where we just talk about Warlock.
Oh yes, I should wear my
Warlock.
Warlock T-shirt.
Oh, Warlock. I mean, Warlock is totally interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hey,
absolutely.
before we continue, I do have a couple comments here that are from the listeners and viewers for today. So we do have David Hazan saying hello, boys. He mentioned, Bill, to your comment about coming out story, he sees the Weapon X story as more of a breaking out story. So it's like this is him sort of breaking out into himself, probably. But then also has a little comment here that I thought was kind of neat. Starting to think that this is why Hugh Jackman works so well as Logan. Like there's this underlying unspoken queerness to that man, which I will agree that Hugh Jackman does have that kind of,
Let's see what the divorcing wife has to say.
We'll definitely see there. I mean, they have been together for a very long time, so it's a very long-lasting beard. And then Vince Tenebra here, who's joined us, is there a message that says someone who is innately themselves good or bad is essentially unchanged no matter what you do to them, in reference to everything that the Weapon X program does to Wolverine? Was he always there? Is everything that's being put into him, or whatever that's coming out of him.
That's the nature versus nurture question.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
Go ahead. And this little tidbit here, is adamantium just internalized homophobia? Maybe. Poisoning us from the
it's
core.
funny that I've gotten that comment before. Yeah, that adamantium process is internalized homophobia that he has to reject. Right.
But isn't internalized homophobia because it's being forced on him? So
true.
Something that was put there by someone else, and then he has to kind of work
but it's eventually the thing that kills him.
It does. It kills him, but then he's fine with it later. Like I don't know what the message is sent there. That it's like, oh, never mind, you got better. Like
his healing factor eventually healed the homophobia, internalized homophobia.
Okay, I'm going to steal something from Caleb. I had to let him talk because he's obviously having the time of his life.
I'm having a blast. I really am. I'm geeking out. I'm having a blast.
Caleb had touched on viewing things through a socio-political lens, and very often the characters that we read and enjoy are products of the time that they're born in. There's no Fantastic Four or Hal Jordan without the space race.
Yeah.
There's no Punisher without the Vietnam War. There's no Luke Cage without the Black Power movement. Wolverine's a little different. As a character that came out in the 70s, there really isn't much development. He's Canadian, he's short, he's got claws, he's a mutant. That's basically what you get at the beginning. But as things progress through the 80s, and this is Chris, I was just wondering if this is something you touched on in your book, when you mirror that with the AIDS epidemic, and here's a character who is infected, but he's the opposite of what hordes of gay men were going through, and that he can't die. Where in real life you're looking at a shortened lifespan, and I never thought of the Wolverine much as a nurturer, or I guess since we're not saying paternal, maybe gunkle. I never really considered that, but then I'm thinking through the X-Men in the 80s. You do see some development towards that line, and when we were dealing with AIDS, we did have the unexpected guardians. We did have people that fill that role who you never thought would. And some of it was out of necessity, some of it was out of compassion, some of it was out of sensibility. I was just wondering, of Wolverine's character development, basically happening during the AIDS era, if that's an element of your analysis at all in the
book. The short answer would be no. I hadn't really thought about him in relation to the AIDS epidemic. I will fully admit that I have not reread in a very long time the whole legacy virus stuff, which I think is the closest thing that Marvel did to sort of like an AIDS story.
Yeah.
And I'm not 100% sure what his role was in that. Does anybody know? I have to express ignorance.
Yeah, I have to plead.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look. Like that's to answer your question, like I feel like it would be interesting to see what happened during the legacy virus era, because like a lot of critics have talked about like the ways in which the legacy virus is totally like an AIDS metaphor. And so I would be really curious to see what happened, because he's an interesting character in terms of blood, right? Because people have used his blood as a healing agent, right? So it's like they've
Mhm.
taken some of his blood to like help them overcome something. So that's an interesting metaphor. But I would have to go back and look again. You raise a really good question, Bill. I'm not totally sure. I mean, so I think metaphorically, right? So to to go back to your question, like if we're reading, if the '80s, AIDS epidemic is going on, mutants are queer, Wolverine sort of plays a sort of mentor role, but he mentors individually. You know what I mean? Like he sort of picks and chooses.
Mhm.
So it's like he's got his Kitty Pryde, he's got his Jubilee, he's got his Colossus, he's got his armor. Well, that's a little later. I'm like he sort of works one on one. I feel like with
Mhm.
various mutants. So anyway, yeah, I think to answer your question more professionally, I'd have to actually go back and look at the Legacy Virus stuff
Yeah.
just to see what role he played because like that's the most overt metaphor I can think of.
Yeah. But I was just
I
also
mean,
thinking
like,
just outside of that because a lot of the Muty go home, and
right,
a lot of that
right,
sensibility that was really prevalent in mid '80s X-Men.
right,
It has a direct correlation with the growing conservatism in the United States and
right,
how that prevented progress in terms of medical research and some other
right,
developments.
right.
So, and again, this was, as I said, uh, Weapon X as a coming out story, came about at 9:58. This came about at 10:24.
Yeah.
So I think that's also testimony to how potent this character is because there's a lot of shit we threw at you here in terms of questions, you know,
Yeah.
and there's a lot
Well,
of ways that there's a lot of hooks you can hang on him
right,
because
Mhm.
because it's a character like Spider-Man that doesn't sleep.
right,
I mean, he could make all these appearances.
right,
One of
right.
my favorite lines ever about Wolverine isn't really about him, but about his circumstances. It's in New Avengers #1
Mhm.
when they're forming the team, and Captain America says he's an X-Man, and Iron Man says he can be both. When they're talking about the team, that's and that's one of my
Right.
favorite, and I think that that is some testimony to how varied the interpretations of the character and how broad the perspectives that we can assign to him are. So
Mm.
really interesting.
Well,
Yeah.
Yes.
interesting what you would talk about, like the comparison to the AIDS epidemic. I think Wolverine, if you look at it in sort of like a very specific way, maybe the death of Wolverine could be his
Yeah.
struggle, or like
Mhm.
his body is deteriorating. He's no
Right.
longer healing himself.
Right.
He's covered in lesions.
Lesions.
There's a
Right. Yeah.
lot of
Bullet
there's a
holes.
lot of like
And
corollary
that's
there.
one area of his life where he's closeted. He didn't tell anybody.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, he
Yeah.
didn't
Right.
tell anybody about
Right.
this. He was
Right.
trying to keep this hidden, and eventually, it will kill him,
Mhm.
and that's what's going to happen. Of course, he gets better.
When
He gets
I
better.
Like,
think of too, I think of
so,
his role
so,
in the Phoenix saga with Jean and like loving her and watching this thing literally consume her and not being
Yeah.
sure what to do. Now, I
Right.
don't know how far you follow that because eventually he puts his claws through her,
Right.
but like because he's not going to let the thing like take over and destroy everybody. So I mean, but
Right.
I think there's a lot of those moments, and again, it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Chris, that it's not necessarily what the writer intended.
Right.
It's the reader's relationship to the story and the environment in which the what those stories mean today in 2023. As I read them, I'm going to think different thoughts than I would
Sure.
have
Sure.
read if I
Mhm.
had have been able to read it when it first came out. And so it
Absolutely.
really is the environment
Absolutely.
that the
Sure.
reader is in that dictates what the story is.
Right. Absolutely.
To,
Well,
a, to, a degree,
and
to a degree.
now that and what I'm thinking about, like, so if I'm thinking about '80s storylines, right? Like, is Inferno, like, is Inferno an AIDS metaphor here? Like, in which case he gets infected. But like, you know what I
yeah,
mean? I'm really wondering, like, Because what that's eight is that it's 88, 89, like 87, 88, 89, like
89.
right. So that's sort of like peak.
Oh, no, maybe 87.
Right.
No,
So that's those late
later.
80s is sort of like the peak, like public eye stuff, right? Like early 80s, it's still like if we think about AIDS epidemic in terms of the narrative arc, early 80s, it's still very contained in sort of the geek community, right?
It's
not a public
Dazzler,
thing.
Disco, and Blow.
Right, and you know, Reagan hasn't said AIDS yet, you know, any of that stuff.
Yeah.
It's late 80s where it's like that explosion of public, you know, scrutiny, I feel like. And so that's really kind of coincides with Inferno. And that's all about an infection, right? I mean, New York City's completely infected by demons. And now I'm wondering, like, wow, could we read something into this? I haven't really thought about it that way before.
I mean, anyway. the Brood is gay panic. I mean, you know.
Well, what does that make Brew? What is Brew? If Brew is like, you know, the academic
Brew is he's the consummate bisexual.
Yes.
Okay. Also is the leader of the I mean, we haven't even touched on the fan fiction side, but I think that's going to be way too much to talk about.
Look at Wolverine. I mean, we could just simply say, look at Wolverine fan fiction. It's pretty hot.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I know what I was thinking when I was younger reading Wolverine. I'm like, I could imagine some interesting scenarios for him.
It is amazing the extent of the BDSM stuff for Wolverine. It was like when I was writing that chapter, it was like, okay, so I know I want to like focus on this. It's like, oh, I really just have to focus on Nightcrawler stories, because if I try to do other stuff, I mean, I would never stop reading. It's like there's so much out there. There's a lot.
I can imagine a lot of it involves cigars.
Well, a lot of it involves him being the bottom, being the sub, which is fascinating, right? So that's one of the things I would talk about in that chapter, like that.
He going on the recon scale. Logan ain't 100% active.
No,
he's not 100%.
No, he's not. Like 60, maybe 60. He has this.
Well, he can take the pain. He just keeps getting better. So it's just
that's right. That's right. He could just do it.
But he probably is the ultimate power bottom. Let's face that.
Yeah. I mean, Nightcrawler puts him through his paces. I mean, we can have a whole conversation about tail fucking, because that happens a lot in these stories.
I can imagine. I think that's been kind of like Nightcrawler fan fiction, sexual fan fiction from day one. Was like, what does that tail do? What that tail do?
What that tail do?
What does that tail do? It turns out it does a lot of things. It does a lot of different things.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
all right. Well, I think. Well, Caleb, was there something else you want to get out?
No, I was just gonna like this.
Look at that. Look at that.
I'm glowing. Like I really am just having this was fun. This is a fantastic time, and I think it too. Like to that degree, that speaks to the quality of the stuff that's in the books. Like Steve, I have not finished the book. I've read the bulk of like the first 3 or 4 chapters, which I don't know how long the book is because I have not finished it yet. But all of this spills out of what I've read, right? Like all of this conversation, which speaks to the depth that you go into it. And I will say, look, academic writing is not everyone's cup of tea, right? I actually was talking to my husband about this, and I read the first chapter of it to him, and he just looked at me like as his eyes kind of unglossed for a second. He was just like, I'm so happy you found your people, because I would he's like, I lived through your undergrad years, right? I was that person. I'm so glad you found your tribe. And you know, the same thing, it goes back to the book that our friend Zach Crucy wrote, where he's talking about Ditko. Like I ate that book up. I've read it twice now. I think it's fascinating, right? Talking to him about it, he's just like, what? Like, why can't you just read Spider-Man comics? I'm like, no, like this has a thing, right? I ruined. I mean, Wonder Woman 1984. Like, I went off on that movie, and he was like, it's just a bad movie, and I was like, no, it's not. Like, but this, the reason I say that, like, reading this kind of has the best of both worlds, right? This is academic. You're citing things. But the tenor in which you write is engaging, right? You are bringing a novelistic quality to academic writing, and I really appreciate that. And I wanted to say that to you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. That means a lot to me because I don't want to be. I really. And we can talk about the change in my career because it's comic studies was not where I started. This is where pandemic really changed the tangent of my career. But it's really nice to hear you say that because I really want to sort of bridge the sort of academic, town gown stuff, and reach out to a wider audience, which is why I love coming on these podcasts because it's like I get to talk about this stuff and people then feel like, oh yeah, I saw you on so and so podcast and I read your book and I loved it. And I was like, yes, that's what I wanted to hear. Like, I'm glad that this is, I'm reaching out to you in this way. Yeah. So I'm very happy to, thank you. You're making me blush.
Oh.
Shucks. Oh, shucks.
That's my superpower.
Again, we're thrilled to have you. So, Chris, if people actually want to get the book, how would they go about it?
Okay. So that's a really great question. So it's available through Rutledge. So if you go to the Rutledge website and you type in my name in or Queering Wolverine, it'll come right up. It's rutledge.com. And you can actually, because it's an academic book, it tends to be a little bit more expensive, but the ebook is pretty cheap. And also if you just want to rent it, because it's sort of a short book, it's part of a series that's meant to be sort of like a short, theoretical approach to a particular character. So if you wanted to rent it, it's even cheaper. So I recommend that you go with that route if you can, because you don't need to spend tons of money, or just use your local library.
Yay, libraries.
Yeah.
Yay, libraries.
I've got a shit ton of recording equipment. Do you want to make the audiobook? Because you can just
we could do that. But put it on Audible.
And in terms of your
What's
your socials, where would people reach out to you?
I'm most active on Blue Sky. And it's Professor Wolvie there, or it's Prof Wolvie there. And I'm also on Discord. So if you either of those places, that's where I'm most active.
All right, very cool. So we're gonna keep moving on. Again, Chris, thank you so much for coming on. This is so cool, and
Hey, I appreciate it.
I know with Caleb, at the very least, this could have gone on 10 hours, but we just don't have that bandwidth right now. We're gonna skip news, so it's nice to say that we're bumping Mark Millar. Given recent developments, that feels good. But
I'm not sad about that.
I'm not sad about that at all. I'm heartbroken, but I'm not sad. If you are a regular listener to the Comic Book Bears, you know that we have a roundtable section where we each talk about a comic book or books, plural, depending upon the time that we have allocated, about something we're reading that we're digging. So we're going to keep going with that, and Chris is very graciously going to join us for this. We have kind of adopted we're kind of a bit crass where we do like the Marvel and DC books before the indie books, but there's a rationale behind that, I have to say. I'm still a producer at heart. So we're going to start with Caleb, who has a pretty interesting Marvel book that he wants to talk about. And I've read the first issue. I haven't gone beyond that. So I'm interested to hear what goes on beyond what I've experienced. So take it away, Caleb.
Okay. Well, so I actually was planning. So I have read all 4 issues of this, and Bill's right. The book that I was going to bring to the table tonight does come from Marvel, and it is Marvel Unleashed. And I picked up this book, number one, for a variety of reasons. But look, if you know me, I'm a dog person. Like, I've got 3 of them. They're a big part of my life. You give me super pets on any degree, I'm a happy camper. But you throw Lockjaw on the front of it, and it will be picked up. Like, I will spend copious amounts of money on this book, right? And to date, we have got 4 issues, and that pretty much, I think, is gonna. There may be one more issue. I don't know. They wrap up the art pretty well, right? But this book is lovingly written by a pretty amazing creative team, and I would have picked it up just based on the creative team alone. It's written by Kyle Starks, who I have been a huge fan of from Jump. I love that man, right? I mean, whether we're talking about just everything he's done has been fantastic. Rock Candy Mountain, just great.
Sex Castle.
Sex Cat, yeah, just all of it is good. And also, if you've ever heard him speak, like I don't know that they make an octave that low, because he's just a giant of a man and he wears overalls, and I respect that about him. But also, it's drawn by Jesus Hervas, and then it's colored by Yin Nitro, and of course Joe Caramanga, who is like one of the 3 letterers that still exist in the world, does all the lettering. Like that dude, like that man makes money because he just is everywhere. So I'll give you the plot of version of at least the first chapter in a nutshell before we kind of branch off in it, right? Our boy Lockjaw's just enjoying a lazy day in the sun. Looks like he's out in Central Park just chilling. All of a sudden, Craven the Hunter shows up out of nowhere, slaps him with a tranquilizer, kidnaps him. There's a little bit of a fight because Lockjaw ain't no punk, and he's going to give as good as he gets. But ultimately, it's Craven the Hunter, right? Like you give enough Quaaludes to anybody, he's going to take a disco nap, and that's what Lockjaw does. Lockjaw just catches some Z's. We don't know what happened other than Craven the Hunter is Craven the Hunter, right? The book then, to that point, cuts to an alley, right? Somewhere in Manhattan, there's an alleyway, and Pizza Dog, right? Lucky is just like doing puppy things, looking for pizza in the trash, is living that alleyway life, and he like hears something behind him, and he turns around and he sees a German Shepherd-esque looking dog with a particular mask that I'll get to in a second, and a little poodle, just doing little poodle things. These are new characters, right? The one dog introduces the German Shepherd dog, introduces herself as D-Dog, right? So we now have a D-Man analog. I am over the moon by this point. Just rainbows and just happy thoughts galore. D-Man, I've said it before, I love the character. There's also particular fanfics I would read of that character, right? Like it's good stuff. But D-Dog has found one of D-Man's old masks, like rummaging through the garbage, right? So there's this continuity that's there. The reason D-Dog has found Lucky and that D-Dog and this poodle are bouncing around is because the poodle is kind of come to D-Dog as this kind of like Heroes for Hire thing. D-Dog's owner has up and vanished. Not sure where or not D-Dog, sorry. The poodle's owner has just up and disappeared, right? And poodle comes to D-Dog. Hey, owner gone. No treats are being given. Help. And D-Dog has no powers, right? This is just D-Dog, right? Just a dog that was a stray, had a hard life, found a mask, and is like, you know what? I'm going to do good in the world because I'm a good dog. Oh my God, just heart just melting, just like, and like I want to pet this baby so bad and give it all the bones. But is a good dog and is going to do good dog shit. So takes the case and is going to be a detective. So and go start looking for other creatures. Luckily, we stumble upon Lucky, and then Lucky's going to help pitch in. So they go back and they do some doggy detective work, and they bust up into the family home. But before they do that, on the way there, they got to get some backup, right? We got to. This is a really cool thing that we are meeting the entire team. Like this is the getting the gang together story, which I also love. So they swing by where else but Avengers Mansion because there's other pet pals that live in Avengers Mansion. But who opens the door? Bill, tell them who opens the door.
Is that
Jarvis?
Wait, it's Jarvis, yeah.
Yeah, it's We get Jarvis. Like the Avengers nerd in me just goes ham. Like we're getting Jarvis in the Avengers Mansion. So I don't know where this book takes place at, what quote unquote universe, right? But we're back in the Avengers Mansion. Jarvis is answering the door, and Jarvis opens the door to just some dogs, one of which is in a tattered old mask, just barking at him. And he's just like, "Hi, you want some cucumber sandwiches?" Like what? That's just how weird this man's life is. He just rolls with the punches. He's just like, "Sure, why not?" Like, I don't know who's not here. Like, oh, look, D-Dog. What? Like, there's a mask. Lucky, what are you doing? Where's Hawkeye? I don't understand. And then Falcon comes out of nowhere, right? Red Wing, the Falcon's Falcon comes out of nowhere. And we have this little team up. Also, the Flurkin gets involved. So now we've got more Avengers pets on this team.
When did Carol's Flurkin get named Chewbacca? When did that happen?
It had to have been. I think it was in one of Kelly Sue's books.
Okay.
Like that would make sense because that's like I've always known
it's not Goose. It's one of Goose. It's one of Goose's children. Yeah.
It had to have been in Kelly Sue's run somewhere.
Marvel Universe. Okay.
Yeah, but Yep. Falcon, Flurkin jump in, and so now they're going to keep going, and they're going to go to the brownstone to find out, to do some research, and they do, and for the most part at this point, there's been some misdirection, right? Like you're like, okay, Poodle's missing her owner. No dog misses their owner this bad if the owner's good, right? Maybe not. Maybe bad people can be good pet parents too, because they roll up in this dog's house, start snooping around, and they find an AIM suit. Dun dun dun. Right? Like this is big doings. They're like, hey, like your owner doesn't seem like the best of people, and the poodle is instantly like, bruh, 4 treats a day, tummy rubs. Like, what are you talking about? Best dude in the world. He just has a job. Quit hating. They've got to figure out what's going on. And again, they don't know what's happened to Lockjaw at this point. Like all of this is just kind of happening at the same time. So they go about, they do a little bit of work. Luckily, dogs have a sense of smell that is well and beyond anything that that humans can do. And Pizza Dog and D Dog team up, and they go and they track down. They are following the scent of the owner. At least they think. It's the owner, it's AIM, it's both, it's one and the same, but it leads them to an AIM safe house, and they have to end up fighting an AIM contingent, which is hilarious in its own right. They finally escape those nut jobs and just get out to luckily start following the right scent, and they come to a cave. This is ominous because I don't know, I've been to New York. There's not a lot of caves there, but apparently there's a cave. And they come down the cave steps, and of course, Red Wing is being Red Wing, which Red Wing's kind of a dick in this. Never knew Red Wing.
That was one of the nicest developments out of Lockjaw and the Pet Avengers was Red Wing is a snob.
Yeah,
and it's really funny because he lives in Harlem, where you don't think and he has a very different perspective of our shared reality. And that was one of the nicest developments out of Lockjaw and the Pet Avengers. That's how Red Wing rolls.
He is very sure of himself. He's very pretentious and is his own biggest fan. Like, is just believes that he knows everything that the people around him know. Like, and it's hilarious, right? As far as like Kyle Stark's writing kind of dry deadpan humor, it just wins every time. So our team are these adventuring animals. They bebop down these steps into this cave, and they stumble upon a scene out of just like, okay, somebody's worshiping the devil down here, right? Like there are candles everywhere. Lockjaw's in the middle of it with some type of like spectral collar, and we see Craven the Hunter talking with the poodle's owner, who of course is an AIM scientist and is behind all of this, at least as far as the first issue goes, and is doing some nasty stuff. And that nasty stuff includes working with Lockjaw, using those teleportation powers to bring in, of all people or all entities, like Blackheart into the universe, right? The just evil incarnate. They're using Lockjaw to do it. And so our beloved, benevolent pet heroes are now pitted against not only AIM, but also one of the biggest supernatural entities in Marvel Universe. And they got to call in the big guns. And when you call in the big guns, when you're fighting a god, which the devil is a god, Blackheart's a god, you fight a god with a god. And so thunder and lightning rain down, and the greatest hero of all, Throg, rolls in like a motherfucker and just lays down the hammer. So, and that's where issue 2 is really going to take off. Before we talk about that, though, Bill, what was your experience with this? I'd love to hear you about
I really wanted to like it, and I fell short of really liking it.
Okay.
Because I did think that there were some. It had a disjointed feel. There were things that I love that touch that that the poodle's owner was AIM, because when you go back to Adolf Hitler probably was a wonderful father to Blondie. That there's this thing about all of that stuff's off the table. When it comes to people and their pets. And I should love this. It's got Lockjaw. It's got Craven in it. I should love this, but it had a disjointed feel, like almost as if Kyle Starks didn't know where the end game was. I really wanted to like it because I should have, but there was just something about it, and there were just so many question marks hanging over the head where it should have been nuttiness, but it felt jumbled instead of quirky.
Okay.
Yeah, I hope that's a fair assessment.
No, it is, and I picked up on moments of that where I did see that kind of disjointedness. To me, I've actually noticed that a lot. I think that's when writers had a 6-issue story and they get crammed down into 4 issues.
Yeah,
Right. Because I think this is going to be a 4-issue, maybe a 5-issue. I don't think it's much. They had a broader story, and they're then changing it to fit into the format that they have to fit in. So no, I think that's a fair assessment. Right. At the end of the day, like, this is big dumb fun comics to me. And I'm just gonna have big dumb fun with it, right? Like, you give me the D-Man version, and I need D-Dog to link up with D-Man in real life at some point. Like, I need that to feel like my heart meter will just burst and overflow if that happens. But it's just fun, right? You're getting to know these animals, and you're getting to see their insides. Like they're being they're being well written, and you get to see their personalities outside of what you might see in another Marvel comic, right? It's showing you the flip side of this world, and I geek out on that stuff. I love anthropomorphic comics are some of my favorite. Whether we're talking about Calvin and Hobbes, which is kind of anthropomorphic to to this stuff, to Pet Pals, to Ace the Super, Ace and all the DC pets. I really enjoy that, so I think we're having a really good time here. And to me, the biggest thing is that we've got pet Avengers throwing hands or paws or wings to AIM and Blackheart. And then, like I said, issue 2, Throg does come in, and like Throg just goes to the mat. Like, I love, like, Throg is just. But not only do we get Throg, we get Bats, the ghost Basset Hound, like Doctor Strange's dog, then jumps into the mix. Like, they expand the team even more, and we just get to see everything that they're doing. And to me, it doesn't change anything. This is what was really cool, I thought. Like, it doesn't change the mythos. It doesn't change anything in regards to Lockjaw. It just really shows you how a good writer can use Lockjaw in today's setting, outside of being the fact that he's the Inhumans dog, right? He's a powerful conduit for everything, like for teleportation, for everything. Like, if you're looking for if you're looking for a way to create a scenario to shoehorn a setting in, to shoehorn a plot in, Lockjaw is a good way to do that, right? We use Lockjaw to bring in Blackheart.
Well, that was the best element of Dan Slott's the thing was Lockjaw was the transportation device.
Exactly.
You could go anywhere with him. Yeah, I love Lockjaw.
I would say read issue 2, Bill, and see how issue 2 treats you, because issue 2 is more action. It's less getting the gang together, and it really is more action, right? And so I think you get more of the plot. And to me, it was more of a straightforward let's get the show going, and let's get the plot laid out. So and it goes weird places. It goes really weird places. It's super. It's fun.
Okay, yeah, maybe like a Marvel Unlimited, or if the issues are somewhat inexpensive in the bin market. But I absolutely love this picture.
Yeah, this is 2 of my dogs, and I got to read. So here's kind of this fun meta moment. I got to read comics about dogs with my dogs that I named after comics. So that was fun for me. The one
that's
on
Chris too.
Right, say that one more time.
That's Chris as well.
Oh, nice, very cool. The dog on the right, the bigger one, that is Banner, obviously. Like, and then the one on the left, that is Emmy. And Emmy is named after Harrow County's Emmy. So, yeah, that was fun. Also, Christmas in the background, and me showing a little knee because I'm a dirty boy.
All right, cool. All right, let's go to the other side of the big 2. Steve, you got graphics, the book I wanted to talk about. I figured I may as well do the hat trick. Part of the Dawn of DC Golden Age initiative has been spotlighting miniseries on various characters from the Golden Age. We have had Jay Garrick the Flash, we have had Alan Scott Green Lantern, and the last of the three that I'm going to talk about, since I've talked about the other two on other episodes, is Wesley Dodds the Sandman. And that's the cover for the first issue. And there's two issues out right now. Steve, you can show the second as well. Um, so Sandman is I think he's he predates Batman by a month, I think. He's really early. I think it goes Superman, Sandman, Crimson Avenger, Batman in terms of DC heroes, DC costumed heroes. So it predates Batman just by a little bit, like maybe like a month or two. The 1939 character, just like Batman. And if you were a Vertigo reader in the 90s, you know that there was a series called Sandman Mystery Theater, which involved the 1940s tales of Wesley Dodds, the Sandman. And there is some connective tissue to Morpheus, the Sandman. Wesley Dodds does not sleep well. And there are some stories in Sandman Midnight Theater and some other within the character's lexicon that describes that relationship, and it's a very tangible one. And that's an element here because when we first see Wesley Dodds, he's having a nightmare, and very often his nightmares are somewhat involve premonitions. We see the Justice Society before there is a Justice Society. He can't put words to what he's seen, but that's where we start out. So again, we're in 1940. Basically, at the start of Wesley Dodds' career, he develops the sleeping gas, which is how he subdues the underworld denizens of early 40s New York City. Um, the writer is Robert Venditti. I haven't seen Venditti on a book since Superman 78 and World of Krypton. He's been away from the big two. I know he had a very short-lived series at Dark Horse, but I haven't seen that name much in solicits. So it's really great to have him back because, especially his Hawkman series. I think he's a very good writer.
Yeah.
And if you were a fan of Sandman Mystery Theater, which is written by my beloved Matt Wagner, my alternate, there's a parallel universe where Matt and I have had a 32-year romance, and I'm certain that multiverse, that planet in the multiverse exists. But he basically documented the stories of Wesley Dodd in the 1940s, and very much used that style. Think of the shadow mixed with a little bit of the Thin Man, because a big character in Wesley Dodd's life is his girlfriend, socialite Diane Belmont. And she's here as well. So what we have with the first issue is Wesley is developing this sleeping gas, and he's decided he's going to do something more than fight crime with it. He's going to push this so that this is a use of non-lethal warfare. The storms are brewing. It's obvious that the United States are eventually going to get moved into World War II. And his efforts to talk to the military about using a device like this is unfortunate. They don't go for it, and it's exposed him in very stark terms. Basically, it's cheaper to kill than it is to subdue with sleep. Um, while this is going on, uh, Wesley is leading the socialite life. He's a very wealthy man. Diane is also from that world, and they're basically going to parties to deal with not having this is a distraction for them. But Wesley can tell something's wrong. He leaves the party early where he's at, which should have been celebratory, but instead was, them basically, drinking away um, their disappointment, where the U.S. War Department decided not to take him up on his offer. And he knows something's wrong. He goes home and he sees his mansion on fire. That's the end of the first issue. And as we go through the second issue, he's basically trying to find out what happened, who this was, and he discovers that there's elements of his lab that are missing. There's equipment that's missing. There's his journal that is missing. And where we leave it at the end is somebody has absconded with this technology and this information. And I didn't provide this picture for you, Steve, but I'll provide it here. Somebody both Steve and I described as Dark Sandman. So we'll see where that goes. A big talking point about this issue is the art is by Riley Rosimo. Was it Riley Rosimo? Sorry, there's only one Rosimo in there. And his is a very stylized type of art. It has its fans and it doesn't have its fans. And I have never been a fan of this on of his work on an extended basis. An an 8-page story in an anthology, I'm okay. But I felt he was entirely the wrong artist for Legion of Superheroes. I don't really think his style fits a lot of stuff. Here it does, but he is kind of like reeling back some of his Rileyisms. The characters don't look as deformed. I think some of that is the settings. And and this was something Steve and I both talked about. He's very good at drawing suits.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a big surprise because if you saw his previous work in Martian Manhunter and Tim Drake, that's not an element at all. So I think his basically morphing his style for the time period that it was beneficial. And this is definitely my favorite work of his by far.
Yeah.
I
It
absolutely
looks a
love
little bit.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Oh, I was just gonna say it's that the way that he's really paying attention to detail from like a fashion sense. So like he really brings you into this era. I believe what year is it? It's like 1940.
1940.
Like right at 1940.
1940. Yeah.
He gets the clothing right. Diane looks fantastic. All the suits that Wesley Dodds is wearing, and all the other characters around him just really are so well designed. And it's very much a big departure. I mean, there's still some Rosmo-isms in there, like some of the thugs here, have very interesting looks and facial features and shapes, and
they have chins no human would have.
Yeah, exactly. Noses that that couldn't fit on a face. But when he's really focusing on sort of just showing how the world is built and how people look and the architecture and everything, I think he really hits a beautiful stride in this series so far. So
I also think one of the biggest criticisms from people other than me is he's not very good at action sequences. When we do have Sandman, confronting thugs in the alley, it's very, very well stylized and very well executed. And in terms of Venditti's writing, you have to just take a step back and accept that this is how people in the 1940s thought they talked. It is, basically it's like I Am Vengeance, but in a few variations. But it totally fits the theme. It fits the vibe, and I have to say, and poor Alan Scott, with I should be rooting for my gay boy, but out of the 3 series, this I think was by far the most interesting.
I'll jump in here and say that for what other folks lack and the like of Riley Rossmo, I make up for. I've followed him since Rasputin. I think I love everything that he's done. I love the exaggerated features. I love the stylized aspect of him. He brings something different. He also uses a lot of Zipatone, which we've talked about before.
Yeah.
I'm a slut for
you and your Zipatone, man.
You and your Zipatone.
I own original art by the man. I think he's phenomenal. And I think he's something that we don't see. He's not a house style. He's bringing.
No, I mean, I will always give him that.
Yeah.
I will always give him that. Another artist I don't really cotton to is Howard Porter. I absolutely will give that Howard Porter has developed a Howard Porter style. But I do think something you would agree with, Caleb, if you read this, he's a much better fit for this than some of the other projects he's been.
I think absolutely right. I think it works really well. I mean, I literally I threw up on my socials. I would kill for, and I'm going to say this, people are going to side on me, but I would kill for a Riley Rossmo drawn Rocketeer miniseries, right? And I realized that, like, you know, Dave's style kind of they try to match that with different artists. They don't deviate from that too much. But I mean, you look at the way. I mean, just look at the way he draws high waisted pants. I like it works. Just make it happen.
Yes. Well, it works for the 40s. For sure.
And I think a story like Cliff's Lost Weekend, where he goes on a bender, like he would be a very good artist for something like that. Yeah.
And then throw in some of the weird Martian sex that he drew in Martian Manhunter. Why not? Just go crazy.
But again, that's the book I wanted to promote there. Wesley Dodds, The Sandman, 2 issues out right now.
Yeah, and co-sign on Robert Venditti. Like, that man can, that man can write. Like, I love, dude, that Hawkeye series, which it had its moments where everything kind of interjected and editorial did their thing, but that Hawkeye miniseries was inspired.
Yeah. Have you read Hawkman?
Hawkman, that's what I meant.
Oh, okay. Because I'm thinking, God, he did a Hawkeye mini? Jeez.
Yeah, no. His
that Hawkman, the Hawkman.
He took the convoluted history of Hawkman and just made it work beautifully and mechanically.
If I ruled the universe, we would have had at least 2 Hawkman of Krypton miniseries by now.
Oh, absolutely.
Because and just the conceit where some of these characters can exist at the same time. These versions of him. Oh, he made chicken salad out of chicken shit.
Well, he did.
Because it's a convoluted history. There's no way it isn't.
He did for Hawkman what Al Ewing did for Hulk.
Okay, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
And I think in equal measure, right? I don't think that book got the fanfare that Immortal Hulk did, but because part of that was the artistic, like the art at times didn't track well, but as far as the writing goes,
and he had 4 different artists of the run too.
I think Venditti's writing in that is on par with Al Ewing's writing in Immortal Hulk, which is big. I mean, I've got a page from Immortal Hulk on my wall right now, right? Like that's a compliment.
Okay, great. All right, well, we're going to go over to our esteemed guest, Chris Roman. So, Chris, tell us about a book you're reading that you're digging.
All right. So I think I sent you the cover, but Monstrous Volume 8 just came out a couple weeks ago. So this collects issues 42 through 48. So I admire what you both have just done in terms of plot summary of your comics. There's no way that I'm gonna be able to even touch that, because if you are a fan of Monstrous, you know that it is dense as fuck.
Yep.
And that every time, and so this is one of the few things I collect in trade. So I wait for the like at this point, like it's volume 8, so like I'm just gonna continue to collect it via trade. Even like Saga, like I've jumped onto floppies. So anyway, you should read this. Like you should. It's awesome. But like every time I get a trade of Monstrous, I go back to the beginning and read the whole thing, because the world building in this is amazing. In this issue, like if they've been transported into the prison world in which Zin is like imprisoned all the monstra, and instead of like Maika having a Zin inside of her, now Zin has her head, and so like she's a part of him. So it's really trippy, and there's all this engagement with guilt that Zin has done to his family, basically. Maika has to deal with how she was created, which is a big shocker. There's a big twist at the end of volume 8 about like why they're even in the prison world. Has to do with her father. So like, yeah, there's all kinds of shit that happens in this. But it's like every time you read Monstrous, there's like, it's like, Jesus, like who the twist, like every time it's like it takes it up a notch. So in a nutshell, I'd say, this is a fantastic read, but if you have not been following along with Monstrous, it's one of those things that is well worth starting from the beginning, and just reading straight through, because it is an amazing read. Every time I get a volume of this, I'm just blown away. The art is amazing, the writing is amazing. Like it's always one of my favorite things to read. So in a nutshell, I highly recommend this.
Yes, Santa Takata was a game changer in comics art when when Santa came on the scene.
Mhm.
Just
Yes. I mean, yeah, it's like every time it's like, do I get a Santa Takata tattoo? Should I find a page in Monsters that I really love and have get a tattoo of Zin? I'm always tempted, because I mean the art is she just draws monsters beautifully. Like it's like they're horrifying and beautiful to look at the same time. It's like I don't know how she pulls off horror and beauty at the same time. But man, it's always fantastic to just look at this stuff.
Nice. I have a stack of, I think, probably the first 2 story arcs sitting on my desk, just like waiting to be read. A friend of mine, let me have them after they were going through all their books, but I was like, I have to read this. I have to start this at some point because it's already at volume 8.
Yes.
I've got a lot of catching up to do.
I have that. I have the first volume right next to Wayward, right next to Captara, and someday I will get to these books. Someday I will get to the first volume. I will probably fall in love with at least one of them. Yeah, it's just there's just so much good stuff out there.
There is.
Yeah.
That's my rec.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Okay, Steve, what about you? I know you have a book.
I do. I kind of hopped on this train late. I mean, talking about having to go back and like read everything that came before. I'm going to talk about good old Wild's End, written by Dan Abnett and drawn by I.N.J. Coolbard, who also does the letters. This is a series, and if anybody's familiar with this, there were 3 volumes of this before the most recent volume, which I read, 6 issues.
That's
and
a beautiful cover.
Oh yeah. Oh, the covers that Abnett does are gorgeous. Some of the other covers that other artists have been doing are also really fun to look at. And everything.
I'm just saying, I'm looking at that cover and I'm automatically interested.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So it's doing its job. Yeah.
So, the one thing, if you haven't read the series at all, like I said, there were 3 volumes. I have the first volume here, and it's all a continuous story for the first 3 volumes. This volume 4, essentially, follows new characters at a different part of the country. And essentially what started in the story is, quick pitch is War of the Worlds in mid-wars England with anthropomorphic animals. So all of the people are either dogs, cats, badgers, all sorts of beaver, all sorts of animals that you can find, in Europe, living their lives post World War One, and strangely enough, something visits that part of the English countryside, and it is definitely not human. There's an invasion of sorts that happens very small in some of these small communities, involving these tentacle and lamppost aliens. Very unique, very interesting kind of take on a tripod, or on a sort of like a War of the Worlds tentacle monster. But all 6 issues of this are just so wonderful because the characters are all written speaking in dialect. So if you're not used to English dialect writing, it's all actually written in that as well. So sometimes you might have to go back and reread if you're not too clear on sounds. But I think Abnett does a really good job of sort of easing you into this world and understanding this sort of the small town countryside English. This is a seaside English town in this series, following a fishing boat crew that come back after being out at sea for a couple weeks and the town is deserted. There's nobody around. They arrive, and it's just them on the boat. But they do come across one of the reporters from the local newspaper, who's the only person left in town, and she has a horrible story to tell them, that all of the residents have been either annihilated or they've been somehow hypnotized and kidnapped by these giant lamppost tentacle creatures. And it's up to this group of survivors, this fishing crew, to figure out what happened to the townspeople, to see if their relatives, their families, their friends are still alive, and then try and hopefully find a way to free the ones that are still alive. And there's just some amazing characters in this. Everybody is so fully fleshed out. You know exactly who they are when they're introduced. But just the way that the story is told, there's so much action and excitement, but it's in a very English vein. This is a very English story. Taking the idea of War of the Worlds from like a very civilian perspective, and just putting it in the English countryside in the 1920s to 30s. But it's just gorgeous. The design of the aliens is strange and menacing. What they do to hypnotize the populace is also very disturbing. And after 6 issues of this, there really isn't necessarily a happy ending, because even if they defeat these creatures here in their small town, the entirety of England has been conquered. And there are survivors out there, but they have to find them. I thought this was just such a great story. And again, coming into it late, like starting with volume 4 and then having to go back and reread volumes 1 through 3. And also, by the way, Jeff Lemire really liked it. He has one of the best blurbs ever. It's really great. So he liked it, so that's good. But it's just really great. There's also a lot of wonderful back matter. Abnett really goes to town on this one. He creates like whole local community newspapers. He writes essays in the back of it in the voice of his characters. It's just really, it's fantastic. So it's 6 issues, but the 6th issue just came out. So the new volume is probably going to be released within the next couple of months or so. I recommend picking this up and just reading this on its own. I think it works really well as a standalone volume. But if you want, you can go back. All 3 of the previous volumes are available. There's First Light, I forget the name of the middle one, and the last one is Journey's End, that follow the same group of characters for this set, from invasion to to fighting back. And then this one, of course, is just a whole new cast of characters, whole new group, and their encounter with the aliens. So I think it's really cool. I don't really read a lot of anthropomorphic books like this, but it's fantastic. You kind of forget that they're animals after a while, and just
the one I'm
30
kind of in the
seconds.
mood for this now, because if you remember the one I talked about 2 months ago,
Beneath the trees where nobody
sees.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, this sounds really interesting. And correct me if I'm wrong. You said there's 3 volumes, or this is the
4th volume. So there's
3 collections. There will be the 4th with this one. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. There's sort of 3 previous volumes, and then this new
one. And credit to Boom for running with that, because Boom is they don't give enough credit. Like, that is a fantastic publisher. I love a lot of what Boom
There's
does.
some controversies there, but yeah, I mean they do put out and expose a lot of readers to some wonderful writers and great concepts and IPs, and
And they've
aside from other issues that they might be having, they do. And
they've also been a publisher where they just they seem to be committed beyond the 6-issue miniseries.
Yeah.
Which you don't get even with a lot of publishers I like. All right, thank you, Steve. I'm very interested in that now.
Yeah,
I think your animal book will not make you cry the way that my animal book made me cry.
There were moments, because you do get to be close.
Well,
to
my animal book.
My animal book makes you cry.
My animal book has a serial killer in it.
You remember
supposed to
Pride of
sympathize
Baghdad?
with.
This is
I-
even worse.
My animal book, Frog and the Rainbow. Yeah, look, the Rainbow Bridge made an appearance. I didn't want to throw that. in there.
Okay, we'll do a very quick poll. Comic book with an animal that made you cry. I've got one. Johnny Quest number 11. It's a bandit is kidnapped by a pre-Michael Vick dogfighting ring, and there's a sequence where this breaks your heart. There's a sequence where it's a dog that's dying of its injuries and it's remembering what it was like as a pet.
Mm.
Oh,
Yeah.
All right, come on, somebody else.
So I'll say number 4 did make me cry of Unleashed, right? It's a lukewarm happy ending, right? But there's a book that came out 2 years ago called The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse. It won like Book of the Year for something like that. Made me cry happy tears. That was more like just pure like distilled joy, and like this is something pure and happy. But it did make me like, I read it and I just welled up because there's good in the world, and sometimes, especially, look, I mean, lawyers, we like, I need to be reminded there's good in the world sometimes, and that book just hit me in all the right spots.
Steve, Chris, if you got one, it's okay to pass as well.
Well, Caleb, they made that book into a movie as well, so that's out there. I mean, I said Pride of Baghdad, We Three, those are the big ones, I think. But Stray Dogs.
Stray Dogs,
Oh, yes, Stray Dogs.
Stray Dogs. It's a horror book, but there is some real, heart tugging moments in that.
Animosity.
Oh, animosity. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Mouse.
Mouse.
Yeah.
Mouse.
I mean, that's probably an obvious choice, but yeah.
Still.
I mean, that's hard.
Yeah.
And it's like I teach it all the time too. It's like, ugh. Why do I do this to myself? It's because it's so fucking important, but it's like, it's awful.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to start wrapping this show up, and we're going to go on to our Geek Gets segment. We're hitting Christmas. Look, I even decorated here. Look at that. This is, I think, older than everyone else. This is
that was Methuselah's talk.
This is at least from 1969.
Oh,
so I think it's older than all you. All right.
All y'all.
Tradition. But we do sometimes, show off some of the things we've gotten since our last episode that align with geek culture. Steve, I see something behind you. That's a Geek Get.
Well, this is, like I said, my my local my LCS loves to hold all of these posters for me, so I get to come home with a ton of different posters. This is the first time that I've gotten a stack of DC ones, so I pulled this out just remembering Bill had his book that he was talking about a couple weeks ago, the Justice League versus Gorilla versus Kong.
Oh, so good.
So
so good.
Had to pull that out.
It doesn't need to be as good as it is. It really
no.
It really isn't.
But
surprisingly good.
My ridiculous during the week you get. Bill and I are two people who buy a lot of Happy Meals for specific promotions. This time around, McDonald's has decided to do another adult Happy Meal like they did last year with interesting artistic renditions of their characters. And so they now have Kerwin, the artist, designing McNugget Buddies. So I've gotten a couple of them. They come in these boxes, where you get the character, in weird shapes, and you can mix and match their clothes. And they also come with a little card that is a character card, so you know who you're mixing and matching clothing for. But it's very interesting. It's kind of reminiscent of the old McNugget Buddies from the 90s that came as like firemen or painters or whatever.
Are the adult Happy Meals as expensive this time around?
Yeah, they're still like you're talking about like $10, but it's a Big Mac or it's a 10-piece McNugget. So you're definitely getting an adult meal. It's an adult combo. Just comes with a toy. Because of course it does.
Okay, Caleb, how about you? You have a Geek Get?
I do have Geek Gets. My Geek Gets are not for me, and I'll be very quick with them, right? Roger made the mistake. I'm an uncle, right? Like, I've got my babies, and that's a big part of my life. And so Roger made the mistake of sending me to the store to take care of Christmas for the nieces and nephews. That was wrong. That was not the right move. I got for my nieces and nephews. We have a Wonder Woman action figure. We have a Superman action figure. We have a trio of Spotty action figures. We have a little Spider-Man plushie. We have the world's most ridiculously, stupidly cute little baby bathrobe that's a Spider-Man bathrobe.
I want that.
Oh my god! And then my oldest nephew, not my old, like, I have a niece that's older, but my oldest nephew loves football. I cherish that. Unfortunately, he's a Kansas City Chiefs fan. So because I'm not a complete monster, I got him a Kansas City Chiefs hat and a little, not a jersey, but a t-shirt of his favorite player, the one and only Patrick Mahomes. So I'm providing my nephew with Kansas City Chiefs swag, which ought to get me extra bonus points as an uncle, I think.
Nice.
So yeah, Uncle Santa's in town, and none of them are old enough that's going to watch this show, so I can show you what I got them without fear of recognition.
All right.
So
Well, I will continue with the Christmas motif. As you guys know, I don't have many family left. So Christmas is the time for seasonal depression, and what very often helps me get through it is gifts from friends. And my best friend in the world, Stu Scheinman, who I've known since we were 7. Um, he's a massive U2 fan, and from the fan club, I got the exclusive U2 Octung Baby 30 Live, which is a series of recordings. This is actually a CD. I know it looks like a single, but it's actually a CD of live recordings from Octung Baby recorded between 1991 and 2017. And again, only available through the fan club. And Vince Tenebra, who was one of the commenters on the show, is a massive Hot Wheels fan, and I tend to get gifts along those lines from him. And he got me this beautiful Hot Wheels premium set of DC vehicles,
nice.
TV series Batman, Batmobile, Justice League Batmobile, the Bat from The Dark Knight Returns, and the most recent Batmobile from the most recent Batman movie. So very nice series.
Jeez.
And then something I got myself. I know Chris is a very big Marvel Legends fan. I know Caleb has spent a lot of money on the NECA gargoyles, and there's something to be said, for lines like Marvel Legends and McFarlane, and what was DC Direct, these high quality action figures. There's also something to be said about mass market action figures where you get sculpts and the likenesses are kind of janky, but they're at a price point that they're are for kids, though still, let's face it, it's mostly adults who buy them. And I got the most recent Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom action figures from Spin Master. And
Oh.
these sculpts aren't bad for a mass market. So I got Aquaman, I got Black Manta, again, a surprisingly good sculpt. I got Orm, and I got Mira. So there you go. And kudos to Spin Master for the more ecologically minded packaging that they are putting
that
this
is
stuff in
nice.
now. So that's my Geek Gets. And over to our guest, Chris. Is there anything that you got recently you want to showcase?
Sure. I got
Nice.
the Viz edition of Tsuma Ninhai's Wolverine Stick, which I had not read before. So this is a 2023 edition of his, I think, early 2000s comic. So, and the thing that's nice about it is it has some of his black and white drawings on it,
Very
which
cool.
some critics kind of argue that it's better than the colorized version. It sort of fuzzes out some of his line work. But yeah, it's a good story. It sort of plucks Wolverine away from his modern day into this apocalyptic future kind of thing. So yeah, it was that's what I picked it up this week. I also wish you could I could show it, but I haven't arrived. But I ordered a Russell Dodderman print for my partner for Christmas of Scarlet Witch costumes. So I actually once I realized that was going to be a gift, I was like, "Hey, what about you?" I messaged him. I said, "Is your Wolverine cover available to order?" And he said, "It is not." So I was a little disappointed. So anyway, but yeah, so that's probably my other big geek get this week was that print, but it hasn't arrived yet.
Very
so
nice.
Those are my two things. Yes, I wish I could say I have a good Marvel Legend to show off, but I haven't bought a Marvel Legend in months, and you know I like to show off my Marvel Legends, but I've been so disappointed in their offerings lately that I haven't purchased a thing in months.
You're not the only person I've heard that from.
Man.
In fact, a mutual friend of ours,
Arnie,
Arnie has actually he kind of he fell in love with them, and he's kind of selling off his entire collection.
And he's got everything.
Yeah, he had everything. This is also the man who has a full run of Spider-Man. I'm talking like a full run of Spider-Man. He has he's got 15. Like that's
right.
Like he collects.
Fantastic.
Yeah. All right, we're going to wrap this show up, and when we wrap an episode of the Comic Book Bears podcast up, we do so with a segment we call the Woofs of the Week. In the bear community, if you find a fella attractive, you woof at him, and we do something very similar to that. We woof at something which may be a comic book, but it may also be a film or a TV program or a charitable initiative, anything under the sun that we think you, fair listener, or possibly viewer, may be interested in sampling. I'll start, as I always do, with Steve. Steve, what is your Woof of the Week?
My Woof of the Week is a book that I've been waiting for, and I finally got it. Chris Oliveros' Are You Willing to Die for the Cause? About the revolution in Quebec in the 1960s. And it is a graphic novel that talks about the history of it. Now, it does change some names of certain players, but it really goes through a very interesting oral retelling of the domestic terrorism that was happening in Montreal in the 1960s. From the FLQ, which was the French liberation movement, or the French-speaking liberation movement in Quebec at the time. And he is working on a second volume that will follow up and talk about the 1975 crisis, or 1970 crisis. But it's really interesting reading through this and looking at the maps. And the great thing about the interior of this is it shows a map of Montreal. And I was, following along, saying like, oh, I lived here, and then here's my other apartment. And this is these lines here denote where the first set of mail bombs were set off. So it's really interesting, kind of, having lived there and not really experiencing the situation in the 60s, but getting to read back, and it's absolutely fascinating. So if you have any interest in sort of, Canadian politics in the 1960s or just North American, liberation movements, this is a very fascinating book, and it's really well done. And of course, Chris Oliveros, the founder of Drawn In Quarterly Press up in Canada. So this, definitely something to pick up, and it's got the pedigree here from the author. So I highly recommend.
Nice. All right, over to Caleb. Caleb, what is your Woof of the Week?
Yeah, Steve, if you don't mind, go ahead and throwing up that graphic I sent for it. My Woof of the Week is actually, it goes to a novel this week, and this is going to be the final novel that I've read this year. I haven't finished it yet. I'm on my way through it. I love Southern literature. I'm a big fan of Faulkner, but I like it when they bring it to the modern age, and I like it when smart writers are able to really lay out what poverty is like in America, to really give a good, genuine view, because I grew up relatively poor. I grew up in rural America. And so I see some of that reflected. Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver is an amazing book. And I don't just say that because of all the little shiny accolades it's got, but it did win a Pulitzer. So that's, kind of a big deal. But the book looks at this child who, was born into a very impoverished life, to a mother who, didn't have her shit together, who married somebody out of necessity. It's a life filled with folks who are, there's addiction. There is the child welfare system that gets engaged in. There's all of these kind of things working with this kid. If I had to like give you a 30,000-foot view, I would tell you that it's kind of like Ozark, as written by Bill DePeck and Mark Williams, if it was written by Michael Chabon, or if that makes sense, from Cavalier and Clay. So it's very much got Michael Chabon sensibilities, like they're dropping comic book references. It's very much of a kid, like I like these things. But it's also got the very wise trash poverty sensibilities of Ozark, where you're in the trailer park and somebody's throwing a possum at you, and there's these things that are happening. There's bad parents and there's people who are trying to do the best with what they have, right? They're thrown into scenarios that can be both comical but also heartbreaking at the same time, and it's told through the eyes of a child who really doesn't fully understand what's going on. He just knows that sometimes he's hungry and sometimes he doesn't like seeing his mom get hit. And what that means to get thrown into the system. So fascinating book. I really, really enjoy it. It also, there is a queer element. He grows up best friends with this kid who, from a very early age, is obviously not a straight white boy, right? Is something else. And it kind of shows, like, what is that person who cannot hide, who cannot fit in? What do they go through? And what do other kids see from that? And what can they learn from that? So, fascinating book. I really love it. And if you want really good modern rural literature that's not whatever that weird Trumpy apologetic Appalachian movie was that came out from a few years ago, I'd direct you towards this. This is the better story. So check this out.
All right, nice. All right, let's go over to our esteemed guest. Chris, do you have a Wolf of the Week?
I've got two, and this is going to be like sort of a classic. To loop back to the beginning, since it's my winter break, I'm going to have one of my Wolves of the Week is Spider-Man 2, the PS5 game, because I'm still working through it, because I'm a very slow gamer. So I think I'm like 42% done. And I just got to the part where Venom actually just bites Kraven's head off, and I'm like, what the hell just happened? So anyway, like that is I'm pretty obsessed with that. Like I said, was playing it all afternoon, but I'm a bit of a button smasher, so it's going to take me a bit of a while. And my other one is I'm kind of on my old bullshit again, and I'm kind of obsessed with Twin Peaks again. Yeah. So I'm back. So I just finished season 1 again, and this afternoon, and I'm also reading the Mark Frost book. It's my bedtime reading. So so if you have not experienced Twin Peaks, I know that's not really a contemporary pick, but man, like nothing beats Twin Peaks. I'm just continuously amazed that thing was on network television, because it's like, what the fuck?
Chris,
what were people thinking when they were watching this? Like, what? Anyway,
Chris, I need you to tell me what David Lynch's Wolverine would be like at some point.
Yes.
He would be sitting around drinking the whole time. Like, there would be absolutely no action. It would just be him, like,
Yeah, this is damn fine whiskey.
Right. This reminds me, I can't even talk about that.
All right, Steve, you got a graphic for my Wolf of the Week, and
I do.
What I selected is A Disturbance in the Force: How the Star Wars Holiday Special Happened. This is a documentary directed by Jeremy Kuhn and Steve Kozak that made the film festival rounds and is now available for streaming and purchase on numerous platforms. And it was great to see that it tells the story of the somewhat notorious 1978 Star Wars Holiday Special, but most importantly, showed how it didn't exist in a bubble, that there was this culture of variety shows that existed in the 70s, that it's just, it's hard to really put across what these things were like without actually showing you. And it details the history of why this special even existed, how there was a gap between the films, between Star Wars in 77 and Empire Strikes Back in 80, and this was a mechanism to fill it. What it probably is best known for is introducing the world to Boba Fett in the animated cartoon that existed. But and as I said, um, as a documentary, we have a lot of interviews with the surviving people that were involved in putting this together. But what more importantly, it also provides clips of other variety shows that had Star Wars segments, and these will blow your mind. I had never seen that Bob Hope special with Mark Hamill, and it's unreal the stuff that they decided to do. I mean, some people have seen the Donnie Marie where the stormtroopers are dancing to get ready by the Temptations. People have seen some of these clips. It's just like funny even saying that, but oh my god, it really puts stuff into perspective that this isn't something that existed in a vacuum. And in terms of some other specials that exist, this wasn't as bad. So really happy this exists, and it's one of those documentaries where you're basically smiling through all of it, and not a lot of those do that these days. Again, my wolf of the week, A Disturbance in the Force, how the Star Wars holiday special happened.
My favorite thing
What
about the graphic that you were just showing is
Yeah.
is over on the side. You've got B. Arthur looking extremely smug, while directly over Princess Leia, obviously having an orgasm. Like,
Also interesting that character Amidala. No, what's her called? I forget what her name is.
B.
But that
Arthur's
character, the actor's character, is now canon,
yes, yeah,
and
Yeah.
she has a wife.
Mm.
I didn't know that. That's
Interesting.
cool.
Kind of nice. Yeah.
I love this, and also the one that you didn't mention, variety special, Richard Pryor's show, where he did an
Yes.
entire cantina scene with the
With the
original
actual
costumes and all.
costumes that they used.
Absolutely, and he looked the way I know he was styled to look like Han Solo, but I'm like, this is really like it's just really cool to see Richard Pryor in this, in this scene. It was neat, but
Yeah.
fascinating,
But
and
would
it
you agree with
actually
me, Steve, that
inspired.
you were just like smiling through the whole thing?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I was like looking at this going, this makes me appreciate it
Yeah.
in a whole different way, not ironically, but like actually appreciate the amount of work that went into it and why it exists and why things look the way they do. And the people that did this were not Star Wars, like the people who wrote all the music were not Star Wars
No.
people. They were variety show people. And they put on the best variety show that they could think of, and they got some big names for 1978, I would say. But yeah, it inspired my brother to go and track down the special because he had never seen it before, and he's like,
Yeah.
"Oh, okay,
Yeah.
I get it now."
All right. Well, in that theme, we hope you all have a very happy holiday. We may come in during the Christmas break, since this movie called Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom is coming out, and some of us may see it. So we'll keep you posted whether we sneak in a little episode during the break. But if not, we will see you in the next year. We'll keep you posted, as we said. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. I hope it's not another 6 years between appearances.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
thank you so
also,
much for having me.
oh, our pleasure. And again, congratulations with the book. And I will also say, if you want to give young Caleb there a 26-year erection, queering Hulk.
Facts.
After reading this analysis, please see your doctor if the erection lasts longer than 4 hours.
I can't stand up right now.
I love when we leave laughing and not in despair. That's great. All right. Again, we are the Comic Book Bears podcast. You can find us on the X and the Blue Sky and the Instagram as Comic Book Bears. You can find us on the Facebook as Comic Book Bears Podcast. If you want to listen to us, please download us through Apple Podcasts. Listen to us through many of the other podcatching platforms. If you want to write to us, please do so by sending an email to comicbookbears@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Bill Zanowitz.
I'm Steve Morey.
And I'm Caleb Alexander McKenzie.
If you're listening to the audio version, you're going to hear Woof and an Explosion. We'll be back in 2024, but maybe sneak into 2023. We'll let you know. Take care, everyone.
Bye.